All right, first of all, I'd like to start by welcoming everybody. I hope everyone had a good holiday season and Happy New Year. This is the fourth of the series of panels that we're hosting through the Luskin Center on basically digital technologies and the challenges they're posing for policy questions. Today's is on crowdsourcing, paywalls, and the future of news. I'm going to introduce the panels in just a minute, but just to give people a feel for the format, the way we're going to do this is I'm going to start by asking each panelist to give a sort of a short, couple of minute introduction of themselves and their organization, and also provide any initial comments they want on the topic of today's panel. Then I've got a series of questions that we'll go through, addressing obviously the future of news and so on. And then for the last 15 or 20 minutes or so, we'll open it up to audience questions. So again, let me just start by introducing the panelists. Immediately to my left is Dean Schaefer, who's a producer with All Voices, which does crowdsourced news. And Dean received his master's degree in journalism from Stanford and has published in a variety of publications, including SF Weekly, sfgate.com, California Watch, and Bay Citizen. Immediately to his left is Tori Bosch, who is the editor of Future Tense, which is an initiative with Slate and the New America Foundation and Arizona State University, and that looks at the implications of new technologies. And Tori has been with Slate and or New America for I think about 8 years. Immediately to her left is Russ Stanton, who is now Vice President of Content for Southern California Public Radio, and he oversees their newsroom. And prior to that, if I could have it correctly, for 3 or 4 years, you were editor of the Los Angeles Times. Is that right? From 2008 to about 2011. Mm-hmm. And then last but certainly not least, we have Jim Rainey, who is a political writer with the LA Times and who has been a professional journalist for about 3 decades, most of that time with the LA Times, and he covers government, politics, media, the environment, and a host of other issues. So those are our panelists. It's a terrific group, perfect balance of different kind of slices of the media world to talk about today's topic. So perhaps I can just ask each panelist to give a little self-introduction and to offer any initial perspectives, and we'll start with Dean.
Sure. Thanks again for having me. It's really cool to be here. So I just wanted to give some background. I run allvoices.com. Just wanted to talk briefly about what that is for those of you who are unfamiliar and what we do. So All Voices was inspired by the trip that our founder, Amrit Tareen, who's no longer with the company, took to Pakistan, her home country, after the really devastating earthquakes that occurred there in 2005. She met, as she recalls it, some really incredible, resilient people who had overcome a lot and who she felt had some really amazing stories to share with the rest of the world. Stories that the mainstream media didn't seem interested in, and they had no way to get those stories out to the rest of the world. And thus, the concept for All Voices was born, this idea of a platform where anyone from anywhere could publish anything on any device. At that time, smartphones weren't as prevalent as they are today, so publishing by email or SMS or MMS or on the web. And so fast forward to today, Amra's no longer with the company, but we have over 600,000 registered writers from all parts of the world, and on any given day, we're publishing anywhere between 300 and 1,500 stories every single day. So I just wanted to give a little framework into how we do that. So first piece is technology. The company was started with the premise that there would be no editors. There would be community oversight, but no editors. So what happens when you go to allvoices.com, let's say you watched the game last night, you're a big Florida State fan, you want to report on Florida State winning the National College Football Championship. So you go onto allvoices.com, write your story. Immediately, our system will recognize, based on the keywords that you use, the density of words, the relationship to each other, the location you're posting from, where you attribute the story to, actually what the topic of your article is. So our system will say, oh, this is about the Florida State game yesterday. And then it'll go out across the web and map your article and compare it to other articles and pieces of content all over the internet to see, roughly speaking, how accurate or reliable is your article. And then it'll take that and add to it sort of your reputation as a contributor on the site, which is built up over time, and using that, give your story what we call a credibility score, which is a score of 0 to 5, which is a rough index of how reliable is this article. And that's one of the ways that we scale this sort of journalistic feeling across all this different types of content. And when we do that, we then bring back some of that content and associate it with your article. So say we have images licensed from the game, we'll bring those in. YouTube videos, other stories on the web, will provide links to that. So you as a contributor at home or wherever you are now able to create this very rich 360-degree experience just with some simple text, which is pretty cool. A lot of our writers are pretty excited about that. The next piece is the community. So we have a lot of writers from very, very wide-ranging backgrounds. Some very new to journalism, some retired professionals who worked for the Associated Press for decades. So they do a lot of interacting with each other, mentoring each other, giving each other advice, tips, and the community also helps us police the site when there are violations like abusive content, hateful content. They'll report that, and my team will sort of oversee that policing process. The next piece, which is a more recent addition to the site was initially conceived, as I mentioned, as being sort of editor-free, but we've introduced a team of editors to sort of help manage the content, especially our homepage, to ensure that we're providing a really excellent content experience for especially first-time visitors. So we have an editorial team providing that oversight, also providing some journalistic support to our writers, sort of helping it run a little more effectively and efficiently. So just to step back and just give a quick review, our basic premise as a crowdsourced news site is to sort of work with the following 5 things, most of which I just said. The first is open access for anyone around the world to post. The second is leverage technology to help editors scale and to help writers produce really amazing content in an easy way. Next is obviously our community of writers who are working together and on their own to create great content. Next is the community staff like myself who sits on top to sort of help the machine run. And lastly, you have the journalists providing some kind of direction, editorial oversight to sort of act as a quality control and help make the experience really great. So I look forward to discussing all of this more, and thanks again for having me.
Thank you very much. Tori?
Thanks. Well, first, I'd like to thank John and Susan Woodward and everyone at the Luskin Center for Public Innovation for organizing this and for having me. I've spent most of my professional career at Slate, so I'm much more comfortable with online media than print, for better or for worse. Slate is interesting because it was one of the first online-only publications. It was started in 1996 by Michael Kinsley and was originally owned by Microsoft. And it's funny to look back on the early days of Slate because they show how much we tried to imitate print early on. So Slate was originally only published on Fridays. Articles went up once a week, which seems sort of strange for a website now. There actually were 2 print iterations of sorts. There was a monthly version that was sold at Starbucks briefly. It did not last very long. And there was also a printed version that was distributed weekly to a small number of people who were considered important. Chief among them was Bill Gates Sr., Bill Gates' father. And in 1998, Slate actually attempted to make people pay for the product by instituting a paywall. And it was widely considered to have been a disaster, and Slate has stayed away from paywalls ever since, even the word. A few years ago, I think I and a lot of other people were very concerned about the future of journalism. I considered law school for a little while. But I think that right now, if you look at the state of the job market for new law school grads, journalism actually seems like the much safer bet. There's a lot of reasons, I think, to be excited about journalism because of the experimentation and the new sorts of organizations that we're seeing emerge and the partnerships, so things like All Voices. Future Tense, the project that I work for, is another project that would have looked strange even a few years ago. It's a nonprofit think tank, a public university, and a for-profit publication coming together to share resources and create content that's important and that people also want to read. So I think that there's a lot of reasons to be excited right now. That's about it.
Thank you very much. Russ?
Thanks. Well, again, thanks for hosting us. I haven't participated in one of these dreadful Future of News panels in 3 years. So leave it to you guys to come up with an interesting series that's attempting to break some new ground and expand the conversation a little bit. I very much appreciate that. I assume most of you are familiar with KPCC, but our signal's a little weak on the west side, so I'll just tell you briefly about us. We are The current iteration of KPCC started 13 years ago when an outfit in Minnesota called American Public Media came in and convinced some community leaders in Los Angeles to pull a really underperforming public radio station off the scrap heap and invest in it. And at that point, 13 years ago, we were the 4th most listened to public radio station in Los Angeles. Today, we are the 2nd most listened to public radio station in the country. And we've been on a fairly major expansion kick over the last 2 years. We're trying we're trying to pioneer a new business model for public media that is not without some degree of risk. But we just finished up year or 2 of what we think is a 5-year effort. We've added 40 people in our newsroom over the past year and have greatly expanded into platforms other than radio. We are extremely big fans of crowdsourcing, and we've embraced it in almost all of our forms of reporting over the past 2 years. And I think paywalls are a great way to shrink your audience, and we'll save other comments for that later.
Okay, well, great. Thank you very much. And Jim?
Excuse me. Hey, I'm Jim Rainey from the LA Times. I've been there for a long time, about 25 years, so I can definitely speak to the old media. But I guess what maybe we should talk a little bit about today is that the LA Times, hopefully some of you still read it, and especially read it online, because we've got a tremendous audience online. And so when I talk to a lot of people, they kind of assume we're just in print, but obviously the future for all of us is digital. And I don't know the exact numbers, but at one point in terms of print publications, we were had the second biggest audience in the country behind the New York Times. And Russ probably knew the numbers when he was editor of the paper, in the tens of millions of unique visitors per month.
It was 17 million before you put in the paywall.
17 million, there you go. Crowdsourcing also, popular with a lot of our reporters. We all use it depending on story. Some people use it as sort of a go-to on every story they do. We can talk more about that in detail. I guess the only thing I'd like to say about the LA Times is that with all the changes that have happened, the media in Southern California would sort of not exist, or you wouldn't be getting news in Southern California in anywhere near the content or the importance, the magnitude that a city like this needs if it weren't for the LA Times. So everybody else is kind of nipping at our heels or coming at us from all directions, but essentially every significant story that's broken in Los Angeles is first and almost always in the LA Times, and then every radio station, TV station, if you look closely, their assignment sheet is essentially the front page and the front of the Metro section of the LA Times every day. So the problem is we don't know how to make money anymore. So that's just the rub there. Print advertising is shrinking, as you can tell by the size of the paper every day. Not quite so bad on Sundays, but still, we've got a severe challenge there. And digital advertising goes for pennies. So most of the big print publications in the country are struggling with that same dilemma. The New York Times and Wall Street Journal being in a somewhat different category, which we can get into the details if people want to.
Great.
So that's it.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you. So I'll go into the first question here, and we don't need to go down. Anybody can feel free to answer, but sort of keying off what Jim just said. So more and more of the traditional print organizations, so of course New York Times, Wall Street Journal, LA Times, and so on, have moved to limit the amount of free online content. As most of the people in this room know, you can get a certain number of articles on most of these sites, but then you're locked out unless you're a subscriber. So does this suggest that a free online model may not be practical over the long term for print organizations that need to meet the expenses of salaries and paying reporters and editors and maintaining offices, or then the counter argument would be places like All Voices and Slate. Is there in fact a profitable business model to be had for free online internet content?
I think there's a profitable model to be had for free content, but it's you get what you pay for in a lot of cases. And if you want people to be full-time, just to advertise for our paper, we have a legal staff. So some of you might have heard on the way over here that Lee Baca, the sheriff of LA County, is stepping down. Lee Baca would not be stepping down unless the LA Times was doing what it does and showing that there's a lot of abuse in the jails, that they're hiring people who shouldn't be hired because they've got criminal problems, that the sheriff was hiring cronies. So That's because we've got a couple young reporters, Jack Leonard, Robert Federici, who full-time have been following the Sheriff's Department for years now. And what I'm waiting to see, because Russ and I have been on a lot of these panels, and there's a lot of, we're going to get to this, the future of news is always that someone's going to do this for free, they're going to crowdsource it, but ultimately, especially on local reporting like this, journalism that is supposed to be of the highest public value, that looks into malfeasance by public officials, that sort of thing, it's being done still, for better or worse, by newspapers. And I would love to see some of these competitors succeed, because frankly, I might need a job at one of them at some point very soon. So we don't wish, I used to cover journalism and media, and we certainly don't wish any of the competitors ill, but there's a lot of kind of talk about what is going to happen with the new models, and there's mostly a deficit of performance in terms of hard breaking news. And in LA, I mean, I can say honestly, and I'd be happy to be challenged on it as to the counter examples, but in terms of big news stories in LA, they all come from the LA Times.
I think it's mostly about scale. I mean, I think that there is a way profitable, or in our case, probably yours. Are you guys a nonprofit?
We're owned by a company in New York. We're privately held.
Privately held, okay. So we're a 501c3. We're not supposed to make any money. We excel at that. But it's about scale. So there's only, to Jim's point about digital pennies versus print dollars when it comes to advertising, there is a model. There is a successful model. We are one of them. There are others, but it's about scale. So there's only so much. In our case, we're funded primarily by our listeners, and we have a small, and public media, you call it underwriting instead of advertising, but then we have this revenue stream for those sorts of rounds. But by way of comparison, so we have 30 reporters on our staff, which is more than twice as what we had a year ago, but they've got almost 200. So it can be done, but it's about scale. And in a large market like LA, that's, I think, a particular concern, where you've got a huge population base and a big geographic area to cover. You want as many boots on the ground as humanly possible.
I think one of the issues that we're all seeing in different ways, but I think I have a sort of unique seat on this one. So All Voices, like Slate, digital only, but we're also owned, as I just mentioned a second ago, by a company based in New York called PulsePoint, which is an online advertising technology company. And so what we see there is, just to look at the online side only for a second, the way that businesses make money online through advertising, through other means, is just shifting so quickly and so radically and evolving in really profound ways. So I think just like looking at the online business model for a site like LA Times or Slate or All Voices, like we're all still really figuring it out. And I don't think our digital business plans are anywhere near mature. So it's hard to say like what happens to the print side of that as the online side becomes more mature, the revenue plans start to make more sense. I mean, as you mentioned a second ago, pennies online for impressions, it really depends, and so much of that is going to change, has changed and will continue to change in the next couple of years, to where it becomes really difficult to forecast how digital is going to be playing a role in either a digital only or a digital and print company in like 5 years even. It's really hard to say, and I think that's part of the stress that's hurting companies like the LA Times, who are trying to get more and more revenue online and having a tough time maybe. It's going to change a lot still, I think.
And I don't think that there's one model that's going to work for everybody. I think that there are a lot of sites that will have a paywall and be extremely successful, and there are a lot of sites for whom a paywall would be the end. And there's also the sort of third way, which is the freemium content, in which it's mostly free for almost everybody, but people who want to pay more to get more can do so. So in 2014, Slate's going to be rolling out a membership plan. And a lot of the details haven't been announced yet, but it's going to be a small fee every month to get a little bit extra. There might be a little bit of extra content. You might get free tickets. You might get ad-free podcasts to download, but it wouldn't be taking anything away from other people. And I think that finding those new sorts of revenue streams is going to be really important as well, beyond the paywall discussion.
Thanks. Okay, and I think actually the Wall Street Journal does that now, right? There's the key mark next to certain articles on the Journal, but the other ones you can get. So
I just want to interject to Dean's point about it being a changing landscape. You've already had two of the largest newspapers in the country undo their paywalls in Dallas and San Francisco, which is interesting. I think one of the questions that hasn't been answered by anybody, I'm still waiting to read a story that talks to actual advertisers about what they think about paywalls, because one of the things a paywall does is dramatically lowers the size of the audience you're trying to reach.
Right, and that then the next question we have is directly to that, is basically what are the policy problems of an ecosystem in which much news is no longer free, right? And therefore accessible only to the subset of people with the means and willingness to pay. And of course, relative to 20 or 30 years ago, we get a much smaller percentage of our news from free over-the-air AM, FM radio or over-the-air television. So is that a problem? And if so, any thoughts from policy responses?
I think that we're a pretty long way away from most media being something that you have to pay for. Beyond that, I don't know exactly what the policy response would be, but I would be shocked if we reach that point anytime very soon, which means we probably will, now that I've predicted that we won't.
Well, and we don't have an exclusive on the things that we publish, even if it's behind our paywall, they're instantly picked up by all the other media in town. And so I don't think there's ever really been, I mean, if worse comes to worse, there's other publics, there is republication. I mean, you can go to the library and in the final analysis, and that they've got online access in some ways, or you can, God forbid, get print. You can go to the car wash and get the person who left the paper. I don't think access is going to be a problem given the online content and just the ubiquity of the information we put out there.
Other thoughts on that? I mean, are we?
I agree with that, and I was going to actually say a very similar thing, and I think this is, I think it's also troubling for the paywall model to a degree, because when you have information conveyed digitally, like information wants to be free, and that doesn't mean it should be, but it wants to be. And as you said, it can be republished or, God forbid, copy-pasted and stolen, I mean, so easily. And you can enforce that and fight that and everything, but at the end of the day, it's a tough tide to fight back. And a lot of that really important, if it's really important and critical, the hope is that it will reach everyone. And if there are enough people who care about it, maybe unfortunately for you guys, it will get out to those people. Or maybe fortunately, depending on how you capture it. But.
Well, I think technology is going to keep us out of trouble in that space too, because you look, all audiences are stampeding into the mobile space. And even people at the lower end of the economic spectrum have got cell phones and access to data information. You could attempt to put paywalls on those, I suppose. But again, technology is your friend there. Punch into Google how to get around the New York Times paywall and you see what pops up. I'm not advocating to do that, but I'm saying that it's not hard to get around these things for people whose desire is to do that.
Great, okay. Oh, and some news websites, everyone's familiar here, of course, with television sites such as CNN and Fox. They're operated by organizations that have a major television presence, and then they can, one presumes, use the revenues from the television operations to then subsidize their internet sites as well. So, for example, of course, I'm not privy to all the details of how CNN does things, but I would assume that if they don't make money on their print side or on their internet site, that is something they can help subsidize using their advertising revenues from their TV channels. So the question is, are news organizations without a TV presence then at and they can't have the symbiosis? Are they at an inherent disadvantage relative to kind of internet-only internet print sites, such as everyone here except for us?
I actually don't think so. I think temporarily it's a bit of they may get a bump because, I mean, obviously it helps to be able to blast your website to a huge TV audience. But I think really, as we move forward and digital becomes so much more complex, the challenge becomes meeting the audience where it lives. I mean, I think that's where everyone is going. And I think as we go forward, I mean, younger audiences don't live on TV anymore. I mean, TV I'm sure will always be part of the equation, sure, but I don't watch TV. I don't have cable, and I know that most of my friends don't either, because we want to consume news on our phones when we're waiting for the subway. We want to get tweets from our friends and have a conversation with them around the news. TV is one way. You got to sit down and watch it in your house when you could be out hiking and also checking the news or whatever. So I think that TV is great, and obviously, yeah, it helps, but long term, I think those organizations may even be disadvantaged because they have a lot of bulk weight that's going to keep them from being agile as the environment changes. So we have to go to where the readers are, and I don't think that's necessarily going to be TV.
Yeah, and I think too that there's a question of who you want your audience to be. Certainly Slate would love to have CNN's numbers, but I don't know if Slate, and I'm speaking only for myself here, would love to have the people necessarily, which is because we write for a sort of specific audience. We write for people, we don't really do breaking news, we're doing analysis and commentary. We try to be smart, we have a relatively educated and affluent audience. And I don't think a lot of the CNN audience would want us necessarily. And I think you see that reflected in their website. It is a website that is, slightly more lowest common denominator. And so that's something worth keeping in mind too.
Your thoughts?
Well, other than the 60 Minutes website and CNN's, I don't find myself spending a lot of time on television news websites. Another story I'm still waiting to read is the television industry has bounced back to a large degree in the advertising space. And I haven't seen any major TV stations in town or elsewhere gone back in and rehired the journalists that they let go when times were leaner. And I also don't see them really investing heavily in their websites. So I'll just make that note and let you know.
Yeah.
Your thoughts, Jim?
I'm good.
You're good. Okay. And let's talk about crowdsourcing as a mechanism. I mean, of course, we've got crowdsourcing either indirectly or directly involved with all of you. The high-level question is it competitive with or complementary to traditional news gathering? And I think the obvious answer is it's at least in part complementary. But if any of you have any more thoughts on that, I mean, for example, how do you do issues like quality and things like that? How do you strike the balance with the positive aspects of crowdsourcing while obviously, and Dean already alluded a little bit to that, having some of the advantages of traditional quality control?
Yeah, I think the example you gave in foreign revolutions and places where things are moving very quickly before journalists from the New York Times and CBS or whoever can get there, or even independent bloggers can get there, often it is going to be the people on the ground who now have social media who are going to give you the first look at especially a big breaking news event. I don't think any of us want to live in a world where we're only dependent on people who are amateurs they certainly have a sense of what's happening there, but to take the thing to the next step and to have sources in the government and to have a sense of context and history. I want the New York Times to be there, and I hope the LA Times is going to be there, and the more the merrier. I think so crowdsourcing is great on one level, but I don't think, at least speaking for myself, I don't think I would want to depend just on people who are sort of witnesses but don't necessarily bring all the other skills to the table.
Other thoughts on that?
I think it needs to be sort of alluding to what Jim just said, a bit of an educational partnership in order for it to really work. I think it would be false to say crowdsourcing is the future because I think it's already happening. If you look back at like the Boston bombings, for example, it was a collaboration between journalists and normal people on the ground who were seeing the car, seeing suspects fleeing, things like that. There's kind of a differentiation between people gathering data and information in the field or online, where we're gathering data, which doesn't necessarily require journalistic know-how, depending on what you're doing, and then creating high-quality, important content, which I think does, to at least some degree, require journalistic knowledge. So I think really the future is using technology to do as much as possible to sort of help especially deal with issues like credibility, reliability, false information, copying, things like that. But then I think it's on us as journalists to be educating people as to at least best practices, just basic things to help them be more effective and to help weed out a lot of the negative potential false information, things like that. But if we don't reach out and sort of make it our prerogative to help, I think it's going to happen without us in a way that we won't have control over, or that may not be good.
But then to that example, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think during the Boston Marathon aftermath, the crowdsourcing fingered somebody who had absolutely nothing to do with it, and this poor guy was all over the internet, and so that's obviously a real downside of the crowdsourcing. And how do we, on the one hand, do what Jim wants to do, which is get instant information, on the other hand, avoid doing something which is horrible, which is putting somebody's name out there for a horrible crime that he had absolutely nothing to do with. That's a huge concern.
There's some tools that I think can help with that. For instance, what All Voices is doing with the credibility rating sounds incredibly helpful. When it comes to crowdsourcing on the ground, there's a human rights organization that's created an app to help people who are on the ground in a country where reporters can't go, help them document abuses that they want to report. And so it will help them encrypt the information, give the geotag to the location so that the report can be essentially checked more easily without putting the person in danger. And so creating those sorts of tools to make the crowdsourcing have more credibility is fantastic. And I think where we get into trouble is when we say crowdsourcing, but we really just mean rumor. And that's something that happens a lot. We also saw it with Sandy. People tend to use apps and websites to listen into police scanners. But what people don't realize, but what local reporters have always known, is that police scanners are not the truth. Police scanners themselves have a lot of rumors. So you get people listening to them and thinking that this scanner is reporting what's happening and I've got some scoop, when really it hasn't been verified either. So I think educating people and journalists on when something should be trusted is hugely important.
And there's just one other point I'd like to make on this, which is there was a huge celebration a few years ago when we had the Iranian Revolution, and there was a ton of information. In fact, initially the only information coming out of there, a lot of it was on Twitter, and people, I don't know if you remember, they all changed their avatars green to sympathize with the Iranian dissidents. And then there's an internet intellectual named Evgeny Morozov, who's of all places from Belarus, and he wrote a book. The guy's brilliant. He went in and analyzed what was done with that information, and one of the things that was done with all those tweets was the Iranian government tracked down the people, not all of them, but who had tweeted out that information. A lot of people ended up in jail. So we have this sort of triumphal view of the beauty and the genius, the wisdom of the crowd. And the people that are in power, they don't want the crowd to be wise. Or if it's going to be wise, they're going to turn the wisdom against it. So all of these things that are great, and we all want to use them as much as we can, they can have a dark side. And I spent some time with Morozov a few years ago. And he's a brilliant guy, and if you can give him any side of the use of the digital space to kind of push journalism or to push transparency forward, he can give you the counter argument, and he's written a couple books about it, very interesting.
If I could just put in a quick plug, Evgeny is a Future Tense Fellow at the New America Foundation, and
There you go.
you can read him on Slate once a month.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, in terms of protections for journalists, let's turn to that. Not in Iran, but in this country. Of course, the First Amendment protects everybody, not just journalists, in terms of freedom of expression and freedom to gather information. But in addition to that, there are many states that have reporter-specific shield laws. These are laws that are in place that very specifically provide some level of heightened legal protection for sources and unpublished notes that reporters might have. And I guess the question is there a need to broaden the definition of reporter, right? When you have far more people than in the past reporting news, yet arguably these same people then fall outside the scope of these protections that we have put in place for decades. Is there a gap, a legislative or a policy gap that needs to be addressed for protecting a world in which far more people now are acting as reporters, or not?
I think it's definitely presenting itself as an issue. I think I less to add other than to say just reflecting that it is a problem in that, so All Voices, for example, our writers are not staff members, they're users, and we work with them. But we don't owe them the same obligations or have the same relationship that you would have with an employee, obviously. And so we do have writers, one of whom comes to mind, who is a Pulitzer finalist who writes on our site. And he is now independent, he writes with us, he's retired, it gives him joy to be able to still write. He still wants to occasionally do some hard-hitting stuff, and he has reached out to me, asking for things like press passes or credentials and things like that, so that he's guaranteed protection under those laws. And depending on the specifics of his request, we may or may not be able to do that for him. As a private company, we have to take into consideration our liability and also the reality that he's not a staff member. So I don't really know what the solution is for someone like that guy, but I think we have to at least think about it so he's not in some weird gray zone. Maybe someone else has a more insightful thing to add, yeah.
Well, they had a case a few years ago, and I'm not going to remember the specifics, maybe someone out here does, but where they had it was pre-Occupy, but one of the trade protests up in San Francisco, and you had a young man who showed up there with a video camera and was filming what were alleged to be police abuses, and I don't remember the specifics. And the question became, was he a reporter or was he part of the crowd that was being arrested by the police? And sort of everybody who's got a camera and a pen can now say they're a journalist. And obviously the authorities are going to frown on that because anybody gets in trouble, they get out their iPhone and they start videotaping the police. I'm a journalist, I have certain privileges. It becomes very complex. I mean, in theory, we'd like to expand the definition, and everybody should have the right to report on what's happening to them. But we now have press passes, which allow us, when there's a fire, to go through fire lines and put ourselves in danger. And in particular, our photographers. Does LA County Fire, next time there's a big brush fire in Malibu, want everybody charging out there with their iPhone? Might get a little crowded on the coast highway. So it's a tough question as to how big the access would be, and how do you draw a line there? If I've got 30,000 Twitter followers, does that qualify me, or do I only need to have 2,000? I don't know. So it's tough.
Yeah, unfortunately, our repertorial forefathers weren't smart enough to have come up with a system where we had to be licensed practitioners of journalism, like architects and dentists and all of that. So it is a very squishy and moving target. And while it might surprise you being a gatekeeper of a legacy media organization, I'm not really comfortable trying to define what a reporter is. I'd like to see us devote the resources to defending the act of uncovering or unearthing information and have the argument focused on the act rather than the individual. But right now we're not in that place, and it seems like it's a hard thing to separate the two. So.
Right, but then if, for example, law enforcement were to subpoena someone's notes, then the question of whether that in fact is something that could be fought would turn in part on whether that person is a reporter.
Sorry for interrupting, but in that case in San Francisco, I wish I'd known we would get to this point. They did in fact want this guy's raw footage. I think he had posted 2 minutes of it, and there was another hour or whatever, and he ended up going to jail in Alameda County and spent quite a bit of time. I'll remember his name here when it's too late, but he spent quite a bit of time in jail, and he was arguing that he had the privilege, reporter's privilege. He didn't have to, and certainly we have defended at the LA Times our right to withhold unpublished material, and the law is on our side in that. But on the other side are people who, again, how big is the category? Is it everyone that's out there and that has a pen or an iPhone? That seems like it could get problematic. So
right, and then you can also imagine there could be a public interest argument in the other direction, in the sense, suppose there was a bunch of people filming something and there had been a child abduction that occurred, right?
Yep.
I mean, would you really, in good conscience, want to say absolutely not? You can't have any of this footage. I mean, there's some complex questions that can come up on the other side of that. So.
Yeah.
The Electronic Frontier Foundation has done some really interesting work on the definition of reporter in the federal shield law, so I'd recommend looking at their website.
Okay. All right. So a couple more questions here. So there's clearly a continuing need for local news. I mean, that's one thing that's, all of us care about the communities that we live in and things that are going on. And by very definition, that doesn't scale. We're not going to have the New York Times covering, every small town, or the LA Times covering small towns in Idaho, for example. But in most U.S. cities, most mid-sized or larger U.S. cities, there's one or more major news organizations, like the LA Times here in Los Angeles, that in addition to reporting locally, report national and global news. So when any newspaper can be accessed from anywhere, is there really a market to support dozens or hundreds of different providers of the same national or global news? And so do we have room for, and you see this also if you watch, for example, the number of people covering presidential campaigns, over the years, how that's changed. So is there really a need? How many different views of the world news or the national news do we really need? And does that argue against then having more than a handful of purveyors of that?
There's probably an argument to economically, in terms of making money, to have less and less. But I think all of us who are in the information business want to have as many voices as we can there. I mean, we don't want to just have the New York Times and Fox News and a couple other networks in say, Baghdad or in Syria. So I think in terms of a public policy consideration, we want to have the maximum number of voices, but I think more and more what you are going to see, given the economics of, we had a bureau in Baghdad, which meant a staff of, I don't know what, Russ, a dozen or 15 Iraqis, bodyguards.
$1 million a year.
That's a lot of money to
How much?
support
I didn't hear how
reporting.
much.
$1 million a year.
Yeah, and you had to have that there to protect for the safety of the staff, and it's just incredibly costly, but we thought it was worth it to have people there for years, and we had some brilliant reporting done out of Iraq, which showed a lot of the problems with the U.S. policy there. Now, it could have been done just by the New York Times. They also did good reporting, as did all the big names in that space, the Washington Post, but the fewer voices, the fewer journalists you have there, the more chance you have of the government controlling the message. And the same goes for more power to there is the occasional blogger who will go over there and do it on their own. It's very difficult because of the danger, but we may be getting more in that space. You also, depending on who the blogger is, sometimes a little bit less about who they are, what their motivation is, and what sort of quality control you have on their content. But so the economics for it are really difficult, though, to get into foreign coverage, and even national coverage can be expensive.
I think part of the question, especially with national news, I think when you're talking about Baghdad and things like that, there's a lot of prohibitive issues there. But like for national news in particular, I remember when I was at Stanford Daily, so a rung below what we're talking about here. But I was at the Daily, and we actually talked about this exact question: was how much space of our paper do we want to devote to national news? Which you assume that students picking up the Daily want to know what's going on in the country, but they also could get that on their phones. They can get it anywhere. And I think it comes down to a question of value and uniqueness. So, we were pulling stories off the AP Wire, right? And that you can get that in some form pretty much anywhere. And I think it comes down to, can you provide a point of view that's valuable for your readers, or not necessarily a point of view, but a take that's valuable. So a story about the Affordable Care Act, for example, off the wire for a Stanford student, it's kind of helpful, but if you can really actually take that story and then make something about how that affects your audience, or how it specifically is relevant to them, and personalize it and make it unique for your audience and useful, then I think you've kind of, in this at least specific case, done a little bit to solve the problem where you're bringing national news into your publication, bringing it into what you're doing, but you're making it more actionable and more distinct from, say, a wire story.
Anyone else, Tori?
No, I think that's exactly right. We don't need everybody reporting the same, just the facts at every single event, but people come from they have different audiences who need different things, and so I think the more perspectives we can get, as long as people are reading them, the better.
Okay, great. And then my final question before we then open it up to some audience questions is, what advice would you give to a enthusiastic young undergraduate student who's interested in a career in journalism? Is this a great time to be getting in? A scary time? All of the above? Any advice? And probably in this room we probably have some folks who are considering careers in journalism. So.
Russ?
It's a great time for them to be getting in. It is. No, seriously. So I have given this spiel at lots of college campuses in Southern California over the last 5 or 6 years, but this is the first digitally native generation of journalists that's coming in. They don't have to learn what the internet is. They don't have to be taught what Twitter is. They know this stuff intuitively. At the Times, we hired a bunch of really terrific young folks who helped really move the needle and grow the audience a lot faster than we would have if we were relying on a more veteran staff. A lot of news organizations are trading down in having to make really difficult decisions about staffing, and are parting with more experienced, higher paid folks, and trading down into I'll call it what it is, cheaper talent. Yes, there have been tens of thousands, I think north of 50 was the last number I saw, of newspaper jobs lost in this country over the past decade, but there have been that and more jobs created at internet websites, news websites, and things that have popped up that we didn't even imagine several years ago. The best advice I would give you on the skills front is you have to come out of college be able to do everything. You have to be able to shoot video and edit it. You've got to be able to blog intelligently. You have to be comfortable in front of a television camera. You have to sound intelligent on a microphone and on a radio station. And you better be able to write long, short, and in between. That's the best chance you're going to have to get on. And there are lots of places that are still hiring, including KPCC, that are interested in talking to people like that. So
Great.
I can say from the LA Times too, I'm lucky to sit right next to our data desk, which are a group of mostly young guys, kind of the stereotype, and these guys are brilliant, and they are driving a lot of the stories that are unique to the Times, like going out and figuring out that the LA Fire Department is not showing up when they're called like they should, or they're showing up minutes and minutes later, and why is that happening? And I sit next to Ben Welch, who's the digital genius behind that. And those guys are really the future. I don't understand a word they're saying, and they literally are talking in various computer languages. There's a half a dozen of them, and they're driving a lot of the best stories in the paper. So if, in fact, I think in some of the journalism schools, might be Columbia, one of them, they're now having a joint major computer science and journalism, which I think is really smart. So that's one way to go. Another is I tell people, speak Mandarin. That seems to be a growing economy. China, if you can specialize in something and be really the best at something, you're going to definitely have a future. And the same, you could be in other specialties, but business is particularly strong too, because there's always going to be money to be spent by people in business to make more money. So the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg and Reuters are all doing pretty well right now, despite what's happening to the rest of the industry. And so if you're in one of those spaces, you're going to be in pretty good shape.
Advice from Tori?
I think it's a great time to be getting in. I would say the number one thing to do is, in addition to obviously creating a diverse skill set, is really think about your voice. I get a lot of applications and cover letters from people that are dry and boring, and if your cover letter is dry and boring, then your copy is going to be. I think people sometimes mistake professional for dry. So think about what you like to read, think about who your favorite writers are, and know them and follow them very closely, and just write constantly, blog on your own, and pitch to people, because we're all looking for content. We will take content, if it's great, from a college student or someone who's retired or a professional writer. So be aggressive, try not to get your feelings hurt if someone says no, and keep trying.
Advice from you, Dean?
Sure. I would definitely agree with Russ that you have to know how to do everything. And I think that was one of the things I was really fortunate with at Stanford, is their journalism program is especially recently becoming very forward-looking and very digital, which I think is great. We learned video and all that stuff. I know, and I guess this will sound very like Silicon Valley skewed, and that's fine. But I think for journalism students, really go where the technology is going. If you want to be in print and that's your dream, then that's great. I think print is going to be around for a while, and it's really important, and that's what you should do if you want to do that. But I think the really exciting stuff is happening in digital, and that could absolutely be at an established print organization. It doesn't matter. But I think digital and technology is really exciting right now, and if you get into those spaces, they have been very open to you growing and taking on new responsibilities that maybe you didn't realize you would have liked. And I've been very fortunate at All Voices, where I came in as a journalistic type person, and now my role includes managing the product, running our development and engineering teams, doing a lot of other stuff that I never thought I would have a chance to do, and I've really enjoyed. So I think if you sort of take that route of finding these disruptors and these innovators in content, they're some of the most far out, most radical, most interesting companies right now that are really trying to crack the nut of online content. And if you can get in there and come with a good skill set and be ready to learn and adapt, you can grow a lot, and your career can take some interesting turns that you may not have expected.
Great. Okay, and so we have time for some audience questions. I don't know if anyone has a question. There's a
So
there's one if you don't mind coming up and talking into our microphone.
and they should identify
Good
themselves.
training.
Yes. And we'd ask you to, anyone else who has questions, please come on up. We'd ask you just briefly identify yourself and.
Hi, my name is Nick. I'm a second-year Master's in Public Policy student, and I was curious, just because you said that the landscape is evolving, do you also feel that in terms of how journalists are going to be writing is going to evolve, just because something that wasn't brought up but that I make use of every day, and I'm pretty sure others do, is something called BuzzFeed. And just the thing I find with BuzzFeed is that it's like an adult picture book. It's like they have all these pictures of moving things going along to kind of help you along in the process. And for the time being, that is free. And a lot of what they do isn't necessarily serious news, but every once in a while you do get a serious article from them, and they do a fairly good job. Do you think that's going to influence LA Times and also online sources, or is that just kind of going to be to a specific audience, or do you think that's going to make everything evolve?
I think it's already happening.
Maybe some people may not know what BuzzFeed is. Do you
Sure.
mind giving a
I think adult picture book is one of the better explanations I've heard. Yeah, I mean, it's a viral content warehouse. I mean, they've got, top 10, I think the one I saw this morning was another site, but it's typical, like top 10 most beautiful abandoned spots in the world, or top 5 stupid quotes from Mean Girls, or it could be lots of lists, or listicles, as they call them. I think on one hand, it's always been the case that publications balance hard and soft news and suck people in with the sort of silly, fun content, hoping that they'll also read the really serious stuff that's been around forever, and that hasn't changed. But I think the balance has changed quite a bit already. And I think I read a really interesting piece recently, and I wish I could remember who it was by, but saying basically that the big issue now is that the incentives are not aligned properly. Because if someone goes out there on BuzzFeed or wherever else, and I think there was actually an example with BuzzFeed where they published something that was so unbelievable, but it turned out to be a hoax. But already, you've misled a bunch of people, but it doesn't matter because you've already made money on their page views. You've already gotten that money, and then bam, you come out with the revelation that it's false, and you make more money on fixing it, right? When really we should be verifying first. And so I think the point is that the model is a little broken in that publications online are making money strictly, for the most part, based on how many people are viewing your site at a given time. And that doesn't create incentives for honesty, it creates incentives for getting people to come. And having a huge, widely publicized hoax and getting it wrong helps you from a business perspective short term. Obviously long term it's not good for you. But I think the short term incentives are not aligned long term, and we gotta figure that out.
Was that Tom Skoka on Snark versus Smarm?
No, I don't think so. I wish I could remember.
That was an essay on Gawker that got a ton of attention at Slate.
It was on Gawker.
Yeah. Gawker actually calls this practice traffic scapegoating.
Yeah.
They use viral content essentially to bring people in, and then they use the money they make that way to essentially subsidize the other work. And there are huge problems with using Reddit as your #1 source for viral content. But there is something to be said for that business model. And I also should say that I'm currently working on a freelance piece for BuzzFeed, so I'm a little bit in their pocket right now, I guess.
Any other comments to the gentleman's question? Do you need to write differently? It's not just a matter of delivery. It's
yeah, and I think everybody's writing differently. Anyway, at the LA Times, those of you who've read it for a long time, we used to drone on for 100 column inches sometimes on a longer story, and now we'll only drone on for half of that. So, there are a lot of reasons things are changing. One of them is just we don't have as much print space, and for some reason we haven't figured out a way to deliver entirely differentiated stories, one for online, one for in print. We tend to run the same story, which is not always wise. So, yeah.
If I could add just one more thing too.
Yeah.
I think that the voice that you see, BuzzFeed articles are very heavily, they promote the author a lot, and they want you to keep following that author. And they do that on Gawker media sites, on lots of sites. And so I think that is one thing to keep in mind, is that there is that encouragement to write with voice rather than for everybody to write in the same AP style. So, use active verbs, that sort of thing. It's worth keeping in mind.
Thank you. Okay, we've.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. My name is Dale Nelson. I'm a copyright lawyer, and so I do a lot of my work and research in the area of how copyright law meets public policy and technology.
You might want to mention you're with Warner Brothers.
Yes, I'm with Warner Brothers. So I was interested in the issue. There's a legal issue that's I think, turned into a debate over the last few years about news aggregators and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, and from a copyright law perspective, whether that's a copyright infringement or a fair use. And so I was just really interested in your perspective about whether you encounter news aggregators taking your articles and aggregating them and then passing them on to their subscribers, or maybe in a free service, and whether you thought that was a good thing, because maybe if they're linking back to you as an original source, that's bringing more people to your website, or whether you consider that a bad thing, because then people, if they're getting the abstract from the news aggregator, they wouldn't be going to your website, or any other thoughts that you might have about that practice. And also whether there's any kind of custom and practice in place now, or if you see it in the future about licensing for that type of thing.
We do it on both sides. So it's a good question, and we see it on both sides. So we bring in, as part of our sort of, we call it clustering, we like that word better, but aggregating of content around what we have on the site. We'll go out and bring in, links to related content, or we also publish the first, say, 200 characters of stories around the web and link back. I think it's useful. I think it's a good thing in as much as it can provide context and provide helpful pointers for visitors who are reading your content to say, because I think you really want to expose as many points of view as possible. So, we have our writers' take on it, and hey, here are 10 articles around the web on the similar topic from someone else's point of view. I think that's good. You obviously have to be careful with fair use, and I think we have a limit on it so that we're sort of in a defensible place where there's always no more than X number of characters with a link, and it's not enough, we're not taking anything. But we see it also on other sides where someone will grab our RSS feed, which we use for distributing content to people who are interested. They'll grab it and just repost everything on their site, and we go after them with our lawyers because you have to protect your IP, obviously. So it's tricky. It gets really complicated when you start talking about Google and search engine optimization, where maybe a link is helpful to you, maybe it's not, maybe it's actually harming you, depending on where it's coming from. Maybe it does nothing. There's all kinds of policies that you as a webmaster can implement to make the links that you pass to another site not help them at all. And I think this is one of the things that gets really interesting online, is it's still like wild, wild west in a lot of ways. It's not like it was 10 years ago, but it's pretty crazy still. And it's every site for itself still, to a large degree. And obviously, you want to be careful, not violate any rules or get yourself into trouble. But if we can post a ton of stories that are very, very short with links that help us drive revenue and drive traffic and stay within the rules, like, we're going to do that. And I think any organization should, until we're not allowed to do so.
Questions on aggregation?
Yeah, I mean, the LA Times is constantly, of course, worried about this, because we do believe, at least especially here for local news, that we're putting a lot of the original content out there. And so there are various aggregators, some local ones here in town. We keep an eye on them, and we have a new attorney now. The last one we had, Russ Newell, quite fierce. And if someone, I don't even know what the guideline was or how much, but you kind of had a gut feeling. I mean, especially if they went over a paragraph, and I'm thinking of one aggregator in particular who I'm not going to mention, but would suddenly be reprinting, 5-10 paragraphs of your obit that was brilliantly researched and written, and that doesn't feel right. And if it's aligned and a link back to the LA Times, great, send us the traffic. But when you start to steal enough of the content and all that reporting and writing as your own, it doesn't seem right. And I agree, it's still kind of a wild, wild west as to where the boundaries are.
Does Slate get aggregated, or?
Slate gets aggregated, and Slate aggregates. We have an aggregator called The Slatest that...
If that's a cute name, you can do anything.
Exactly.
You get a few extra graphs anyway.
The Slatest is edited by a fantastic writer named Josh Voorhees, who is incredibly in tune with the fact that he does not want to take anybody else's work. He wants to add value. He says, and it's true, that no one owns the news. No one owns the fact that something happened. But when you're taking someone else's work, you have to credit them appropriately, add commentary as you can, and bring in context from other resources. We've published things on Future Tense that essentially are either rewritten or mostly stolen on other sites, and it's frustrating, but it happens to everybody. So it's not something, at least for me, that we need to get too concerned about. But as an editor, I'm much more concerned, I think, about writers who over-aggregate than I am about our work being taken.
Just a final note on that, too. I don't know if any of you are familiar with The Week, which is a print publication. This doesn't just happen online. The Week is a brilliant aggregator of every big and some not so big media outlets in America. And it's really, in terms of news magazines, it's a lot more fun to read than certainly, well, we don't even have Newsweek anymore, more fun than Time or US News or any of these old publications. And it's pure aggregation. And it's done, it gives credit throughout, so you know who wrote the stuff. But they'll take an issue like the Affordable Care Act, what happened in the last week, and they'll give you not every, but they'll give you all the top sources and what they said, and it's brilliantly rewritten and sort of curated, so you can get everything. And I feel like I'm giving a plug for them. I guess I am, but and it's thievery, but it's done so artfully. It's hard to feel bad about it. So
It is. I like that magazine a great deal, but it's interesting too. I think that it'll be interesting to see longer term how aggregators play out as a business model, because it's still, you know, the oldest ones are what, a decade old maybe, and they're still evolving. The best one got snapped up by AOL a few years ago, and we'll see how that all plays out. I'm not necessarily convinced that they're going to be good long-term business plays.
yeah, we were talking about Huffington Post before we started here, which is what Russ is referring to, and just months before they were bought for what, $300-400 million. Miss Huffington told me she was not making money. She was not in the black. So, you know, this is always given. I'm sure they are now. They must be. You got to think they are. But at the time they weren't, and you know, and this is a site that just has phenomenal number of hits, and it both has legitimate, very serious reporting, particularly out of Washington, and then it does, you know, all the other sorts of stuff that we're talking about. They're the masters of search engine optimization, and you know, if you look at what their top stories are, they don't often have a lot to do with politics. They're, you know, sort of celebrity boob jobs and things like that. And it's all mixed in together, and they just have a huge amount of traffic. So, but whether it's a long-term model, that one probably will succeed, but there are a lot of others who are trying to emulate, and it's hard to get enough traffic to make it work.
Okay, great. Any other questions from anybody?
Thank you all for being here. This has been really, really helpful. I'm also a policy student at the Luskin School. I'm in my first year, and one thing that I was hoping you all might speak to a little right now is just the gap, I guess, in all of the people who could be, you know, accessing the news but who aren't. I mean, it seems, you know, we're all speaking about an audience of people who are a lot like me, relatively affluent and white and educated, and so yeah, if you guys could suggest how things are changing maybe in that, for the better or for the worse, and what your suggestions might be.
Any thoughts?
One of the biggest reasons why I think there's a lack of diversity in the news media, and there absolutely is the internship system. For a long time, a lot of publications have worked with free interns, and to work for free in New York or DC for a whole summer is incredibly expensive. It was a hardship for me to work a free internship at Slate when I was a college student. But I think that with lawsuits that are happening in New York State, a lot of publications are changing their policy. So Slate has recently announced that we're going to be paying all of our interns. I think that's one of the best ways that we're starting to see bringing in new socioeconomic, racial, gender, people from various backgrounds. So that's something I'm excited about, but it's absolutely a problem I think that we all need to pay a lot more attention to.
I think it's a relevancy issue. One of the things that we've been spending a lot of time, having had the benefit of being able to hire, is we've worked on diversity really hard in our newsroom, and not just by ethnicity, but also by age. If you look at most legacy media newsrooms today, they're predominantly north of, you know, most of the staffs are older, about 50-50 male-female, but mostly white, and they've not done a good job of keeping up with the changing face of America. And I have just found in hiring both at the Times and here that, you know, you get better stories by people who come from different cultures and different walks of life, also economic, and you get better stories that way. So we've had some really good luck again, I just am amazed at the intellect and the talent level of the kids that are coming out of the good colleges today is really impressive. And I always tell my assistant, we need to be nice to these folks because we'll be working for them someday. But so there's a great abundance of talent, and if you make it a priority and hire that way, you'll get the type of news report that you're putting out will change relatively quickly, and you'll get better stories out of it.
Any other comments?
Just one quick plug for the Times has had for years, and I hope keeps going, a minority intern hiring program, and it's brought a lot of great journalists into the paper, and some of whom have gone on to fame and fortune other places, called the MedPro program. So that's helped us diversify the newsroom, but it still doesn't really look like Los Angeles, and it's always been a problem covering. Whoa. Because it's such a huge area. I mean, we've got 88 cities in the county, and so just geographically to get everywhere, even when we had twice as many people as we do now, it's very difficult. So everybody's looking for a solution to get better coverage and better readership in a lot of these communities that just don't get covered.
One thing I'd like to add to that briefly, I think one of the things that you're going to see more and more of is already starting, and I think we're just one example of this, is that now that there's Twitter and All Voices and countless everything else out there, everyone is a publisher now. Doesn't mean everyone's a journalist, but everyone is a publisher. And when you open the floodgates like that, good things happen and bad things happen. A lot of things happen, let's put it that way. But you do start to get stories from all sorts of perspectives that you never even knew were there, or that you never even knew you didn't have. Like one of my favorite stories, I think it was last year, no, it was 2012 during the elections. We had a writer who's from Chicago, who's African American, and he had the good fortune of meeting George Romney, Mitt Romney's father, when he was in high school, and he wrote about his I think the title of the story is My Dinner Date with George Romney, and he spoke about George Romney's character and how it compared to, or contrasted to that of his son Mitt Romney, and sort of the differences there. And that was like a really fantastic story I read, just by this guy in Chicago who's a great writer. He's one of our best. And that story would not have been told 10 years ago. So I think with technology, you're going to start to see those voices. The problem then becomes there's so much going on. How do you make sure that the good stuff is actually heard, and sort of you filter the signal from the noise, that kind of problem. But I think it's going to be less and less of an issue as access to the internet, access to technology becomes more and more out there for everybody. Anyone with something to say has the opportunity to do it. Then the hard part becomes how do we actually make sure that the right ones get heard or the good ones get heard.
Any other questions? Any other questions from the audience? You can, if you don't mind coming up and so.
Hi, so my name is Alfonso Roman. I'm a software engineer, and so I love technology. You guys talk about technology as kind of bringing in this new age. One of the things technology does is propagate filter bubbles. So do you believe that print media and radio, do something to break those filter bubbles in a way that the internet news
Sorry,
can?
propagate.
Filter bubbles? Filter bubble is basically when people start kind of getting the same point of view on one particular topic, and it excludes every other point of view. So now they're kind of creating partitions of people and what they think. So do you believe also that that internet news should do more to break these filter bubbles, or are filter bubbles a good thing? I don't know.
I think actually that touches on one of the most important and still most imperfect parts of web technology, especially, is basically personalization, customization. So like Netflix, for example, I think they have a yearly contest for like whoever can improve their recommendation engine that year gets like $1 million or something like that. So I mean, recommendation is a big part of that, right? Because it becomes easier to track, for better or worse, track what people are doing online, recommend content to them, whether it's movies or articles or whatever. And you're right, if you only read sort of left-leaning websites or whatever, you're going to only get that and positive reinforcement of your point of view and all that stuff. So I think one of the interesting things is how do we refine personalization to make it not just more efficient and not just more effective, but actually make it better, where we're introducing points of view that are disruptive and making it a more of an interesting experience, because how compelling is it to get the same article in 10 different ways about the same thing from the same point of view? So I think we're going to have to crack that as technologists. How do we disrupt that and make it more useful?
I mean, the only thing I'd say about that, though, is human nature is human nature. People want to, I mean, that's why MSNBC and Fox are doing better than CNN, because people want to hear the message they want to hear. And you can try to outmaneuver them with technology, but if they start to feel itchy because they've heard too much from Chris Matthews or from Bill O'Reilly, they're going to turn the channel. They're not going to hang around. And that's why you have a very pure audience at those two, cable sites, and you could look at other places on the web where people go. They're going to go to Daily Kos because they're going to get what they want there on the left, and equivalent sites on the right. And I think that is a big problem. In some ways, you could argue in a democracy we have to be for more voices, but in some ways, people, if they just retreat into their little silos, you can have as many voices out there as you want. But people don't have to seek them out, and you can't force them. So it's hard to deal with.
Any other questions? Yes, sir. You can.
Hi, thanks for being here. My name's Phil Hampton. I direct the media relations office here on campus. And I, like the panelists, we're going through a bit of a transformation here in public relations and the way journalism works. That PR works a lot differently now than it did 10 years ago. And rather than simply responding to requests from news media and trying to place stories in news media, we produce a great deal of content for our website that markets the university directly to a much broader audience. I'm wondering if our panelists have noticed a difference in how PR interacts with news media and how your relationship with with PR representatives might have changed over the past 5-10 years.
You go first.
Well, I mean, absolutely. I cover a lot of politics, and so everyone now who has, as was said before, I mean, everybody's a publisher now. The President of the United States has figured this out, and so he doesn't want his picture taken by anybody. A slight exaggeration, but the White House photographer, he'd prefer to have him shooting it. There's a huge uproar right now in Washington because, the guys that are shooting for AP and for the New York Times and other outlets and AFP, they want to shoot pictures too. And so absolutely, people, as much as they think they can get to their audience without an intermediary like the annoying press, they're going to try and do that. And of course, we want to break that down as much as we can, and we want to continue to be the intermediary. But if the audience will accept it, it's another big part of this equation of how the media is going to pay the freight. The New York Times just in the last few days has announced it's going to go to this so-called sponsored content, or there's another name for it. But it's essentially they're going to label it, to be fair, as advertising, but it's trying to slide in front of your eyes something that is really paid for by an advertiser that looks a lot like a regular news story. And we went to war at the LA Times in the past over attempts to do that. It used to be called advertorial, slightly different typeface, and most sophisticated readers knew the difference, but of course the advertisers want it to look exactly like regular content. So that will be another ongoing issue, because as everybody struggles to make money, there's a vast temptation to just blur that line enough in the direction that the advertiser, the university, whoever it is, wants to go. So that will be a fight that I think you'll be hearing a lot about in the coming years.
Anyone else?
Well, yeah, I would say technology's really changed the the game and the dynamic in that a great deal. You see it most in politics and corporate America, where the organizations that are on top of the game can really get their message out without using the media at all. In some cases, you guys have the benefit of having a great product to sell here, and one of the things we look for in our coverage areas are a lot of, especially in the digital age now, when news breaks, one of the first things you can do is go hit a website and try to find out more information. And there's been a lot of talk. I'm learning a lot about the nonprofit world, but a lot of it's about disclosure and transparency. And so, if you're an institution like UCLA or our outfit, the more publicly available documents you put up there voluntarily. You don't make somebody have to go chase down and get. The more credibility your institution has, stuff you already know all that.
Anybody else on that?
Yeah, I think so. There's a couple of things there. One, I think it's interesting the way that brands like UCLA can reach customers directly or potential customers directly, because we're, as I said, everyone's a publisher, right? So you don't need to, although it certainly helps in a lot of cases to go through media, you don't have to anymore. You know, Red Bull, we always talk about Red Bull in our office. They're like as good of a sports publisher as anyone now with extreme sports, and it's amazing. And they don't need ESPN to reach their target audience. So I think it's part of a bigger shift now, where the focus is, again, reaching the customer, reaching the reader, the audience where they live with something they care about. And if you're in a position to provide your potential audience with something that they care about that's useful to them, that's going to win the day every time. Obviously, it's great to have a name behind you like New York Times. The name stands for a lot. It means a lot. And that's not to be discounted in any way. But if you're UCLA and you can provide content that your readers are going to find to be great for them, then they're going to consume that content if you can reach them where they live.
Other questions? Okay, so we're going to wrap this up here. I want to close a couple of things. I want to, first of all, before I thank our panelists, I want to thank some of the folks you aren't seeing, specifically Susan Woodward, Christian Zarate, and Colleen Callahan, who organized all the things that we have here. So I'd like to give them a big and then, of course, I'd like to give a big round of applause to our 4 panelists for a really exciting, interesting discussion. Thank you all for taking time out of your day. We've got 2 more panels later on in the spring in March, April, May timeframe. One is on preventing exploitation. You know, what can we do to prevent digital technologies from being misused for exploitative purposes? Another on digital literacy for all. So we'll look forward to seeing some of you back then. Thanks for your time.